Well, we've come to talk to Dr. Alan Jones today about his recently achieved PhD. Can you tell us what the title is, please, Alan?
It's called Speaking of Science. It's not a very self-explanatory title, but it's to do with science broadcasting on the BBC Radio, from the early days of the BBC in the 20s through to the mid-1960s.
So what gave you the idea for that?
Well, first of all, I have to explain a bit of personal history. That I've been at the OU for a long time, but I haven't been an academic for a long time. I changed jobs a few years ago, and as an academic it was more or less incumbent on me to get on with some research. And by accident, when I was down at BBC's Archives Centre on an entirely unrelated matter to do with music, I came across this story in the documents there about a long-standing rivalry between British scientific establishments, the Royal Society, British Association for the Advancement of Science, rivalry between them and the BBC over the BBC's science output. And I thought, this is a story that hasn't been told. Perhaps there's something I can do with it. And from there on, it was a question of finding out who has expertise in this area, and seeing if I could get them to be my supervisors. And if you like, that part of the project is as much part of the PhD as anything, finding out what body of knowledge it relates to, and finding people who can advise and steer you.
And you managed to find them not in the Open University?
Well, that's right. I went outside the OU. I went to University College London, where they have a Department of Science and Technology Studies. I had a book by a member of staff there that I'd read, so I thought, well, at the very least she will be able to advise me. And I went down to see her, and I said, look, I found this story, what can we do with it? And she said, well, it could be a PhD, I think, and you could do it here, and I could be one of your supervisors. So I signed up, and I think, to tell the truth, I didn't really know what project entailed, but everybody seems to say that. People seem to say that it's only when you've completed the PhD that you realise what it was all about, and what a PhD really is.
So how long did it take you?
Well, I was doing it part-time. It took me 6 years. I think it could actually have taken 5 years, but ended up taking 6.
Right. What was the funniest thing that happened on the
Oh,
course
the
of
funniest
this
thing.
study?
Well, at the Viva, I had 2 external examiners, which is a bit unusual for complicated reasons. But they wanted me, as usual, to make a few corrections, not very much actually. But afterwards, I felt there were other corrections I wanted to make. And I was talking to a colleague here at the OU about this, and I said, well, actually, there are things in there that make me wince when I look at them. I quite like to change them. And he said, no, you don't want to do that, you don't want to do that. It just makes it all too complicated. And he said, and I think he was trying to reassure me, he said, don't worry, nobody will ever read it.
I'm sure that's not the case. I mean, have you thought of moving on with this PhD and creating some more outputs?
Well, yes, various people have looked at it and said, I think there's a book in this. But the trouble with that is it puts any useful outputs several years ahead. And there's pressure on us now to publish. And in the 6 years I've been doing this, I actually haven't published any papers. So I think I need to get on with publishing journal papers from this. I've made a start on that naturally already.
What was the general outcome of it? I mean, you say there was this big disagreement or feud or whatever you might call it.
Oh, between the science bodies and the BBC?
Yeah.
Well, in essence, these scientific bodies wanted to take control of the BBC's science output. That's painting it very crudely, but that's basically the story. And the BBC naturally wanted to retain control of everything it does. And this dispute flared up every couple of decades or so, and sometimes it got quite heated. And the BBC, I suppose in a classic fashion, eventually fobbed off the scientists just by setting up a committee, a joint scientists stroke BBC advisory committee. And that there's documents, memos at the BBC to show that they regarded this as the least bothersome option. They didn't want to give way to the scientists. So what could they do that would pacify them? I mean, well, if we set this up, it'll buy them off and they'll stop fussing and bothering us.
Did that work?
Well, it did. It did in a very funny way. In a strange way, those scientists who were on that committee became co-opted to the BBC, or the BBC producers and managers. So whenever those BBC producers were having a bit of a battle with their own managers, these scientists would weigh in on their behalf, supporting them and helping them with their internal battles. In a sense, what the kind of things I've had to engage with in doing this thesis is to do with things like organisational theories about organisations, theories about professional rivalry, theories about strategies for gaining power. So it's an area of social science that I knew absolutely nothing about, which I've had to draw on to try and put some kind of theoretical gloss on this historical story, because the story by itself doesn't earn you a PhD.
You say it's historical, but is this still the case? Have things
Yes.
changed?
Well, I don't think the scientists are lobbying the BBC in the same way for all sorts of reasons. But the kinds of things scientists say now, which you hear quite often, about the importance of the public understanding of science, are exactly the same things as they were saying in the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, the 30s and the 20s. You can track this, the cases, the arguments they put forward, virtually identically back over several decades. And it's usually presented as a matter of urgency that people and everybody, the public, now, because of the nature of society, right now, needs to engage with science and technology, as we would say.
So much relevance for the present day. I wonder who's going to read about your work and learn from it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I should say that the scientist argument isn't to be dismissed, but the argument that there are special considerations about now don't seem to wash when you look at how this has gone on. Well, hopefully people will find out about it through journal articles I publish. I've been to a couple of conferences. It's in the nature of an interdisciplinary thesis, and there are a lot of people actually working in media history. People working in media history tend to concentrate on newspapers, magazines. There's rather less on broadcasting history, because mostly the broadcasts don't exist anymore, or in some cases there are transcripts. And even there is very little work done on this kind of thing. So I've spoke to people in media history, and they said, "Oh, that's very interesting. Don't know anybody else doing work in this field." People in science and technology studies tend to look at how scientists influence the media, and again, they tend to concentrate on print media or modern day television. The historical dimension and radio has been very little covered. So there's another avenue there.
Well, congratulations. It seems that you've lit upon something which is entirely new and opens up a whole lot more possibilities, eh?
Well, perhaps.
Okay, thank you.